So, hello, Yoga for Arthritis members. This is Dr. Stephanie Munaz, and this is the monthly Q&A call, members only. And I have a few questions that have come in advance, and a couple of people here now, and this recording will go out to all members afterward. It goes out to all members as a link and also gets stored on the back end of the website, which you can access anytime. So just as a reminder, we just started doing this a few months ago, but the recordings from prior sessions are available to you at any time. With your membership, you just go to the arthritis.yoga site, log in with your username and password, and you should be able to find all of the monthly Q&A recordings there. So for those of you who are here live, welcome. And I have set up the chat box so that you can type your questions into the chat at any time. So if you have come with questions, then I encourage you to do that. And I'll start in the meantime with some questions that have come in advance. So a big one that came in last month since our last call was about the relationship between arthritis and trauma. And I think maybe specifically autoimmune forms of arthritis, such as rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, and history of trauma or traumatic life events. So I think that this is an important topic to look at in a sort of nuanced way, because it's not straightforward and it's not black and white. And the literature reflects that. So there definitely is research on this topic, and I'm going to do my best to talk about it from an evidence-informed perspective. So it is not entirely clear what the specific causes of autoimmune diseases are, including autoimmune forms of arthritis, such as rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, ankylosing spondylitis, scleroderma, etc. The rheumatic diseases that fall into the category of systemic autoimmune conditions. However, we do know that they run in families. So if you have a family history of a rheumatic disease, then you are far more likely to get that disease yourself. And actually, that ends up being true of osteoarthritis too, though probably in a different sort of way. So for osteoarthritis, one of the ways that we inherit osteoarthritis is that we inherit the physical structure of our families. And so if, for example, we have a more pronounced Q angle of the femur, that's going to increase the uneven distribution of weight at the knee joint and also at the hip joint. If you've inherited that structure, you're going to also inherit a higher risk of developing osteoarthritis at the knees and the hips. If you, and there's a whole recording that I did with Amber Carnes about body weight and arthritis. So if you inherit a larger body structure from your family, then you're carrying more body weight, and therefore there's more compression on your joints. Of course, just as the structure of your joints is just one factor, your body's size is just one factor. And there are many factors that influence our risk of developing arthritis or not. Another is that for many years, and to an extent it's true still, we inherit vocations. So if you think of a bricklayer whose son is a bricklayer, for example, the patterns of body use that we experience can be passed down from generation to generation. Even the way that we stand, the way that we walk. Have you ever done something and noticed that your hands remind you of your parent? right? Whether that is genetic or whether it's learned behavior, either way, that's something that is going to make certain risk factors pass down along families. We also tend to inherit lifestyles. So the way that our parents eat tends in large part to be the way that we eat, because it's the way that we learn to eat, the tastes that we experience and therefore prefer, the rhythms of the day and meals and holidays we all share. So all of those things can explain why autoimmune diseases tend to run in families, but osteoarthritis, which we think of as more of a structural condition, can also run in families. So with autoimmune diseases, though, there is also likely a genetic component to it. And the way that I like to think about genetics is from an epigenetic perspective. Okay, so you have genes that you are born with, and those genes get expressed. So you have a gene that determines whether your eyes are blue or brown. You have a gene that determines whether your hair is dark or light. You have a gene that determines whether your earlobe is attached or detached. You know, these tend to be somewhat simple genetic inheritance patterns that some of you may have learned about in high school or in college. But then there are the many, many factors that influence the way our genes get expressed. And that's called epigenetics. So for example, we may inherit the genetics for our height, right? If you come from a family of shorter people, you're probably going to be shorter. If you come from a family of taller people, you're probably going to be taller. But what if you come from a family of tall people and you experience famine or poverty during childhood, during those developmental years when your body is growing? It's possible then that you'll end up being shorter than you may have had you not had that experience. So that's a pretty concrete example of how our environment can affect how our genes get expressed. And the converse is true. So with nutrition, we also see that people end up being taller. Nutrition is one of the reasons why humans have gotten taller over generations. Okay, so if we think about arthritis from an epigenetic perspective, you could imagine then that you can inherit the genes for something like rheumatoid arthritis, but then there are environmental influences that determine how that gene gets expressed. And the analogy that I often use is that the genetics are like a switch. So if you have a genetic predisposition for rheumatoid arthritis, then you have a switch for rheumatoid arthritis, and it may or may not get flipped on at some point in your life. For some people, the RA switch gets flipped when they're 2 years old, and for some people it gets flipped when they're 70 years old, and then for most people it happens somewhere in between. That's not just true for rheumatoid arthritis, that's also true for lots of things that can happen. So for example, cancer. We know that there are genetic risk factors for cancer. I happen to come from a family where pretty much my entire family tree has cancer, but there are factors in our lives, both in lifestyle, in what we're exposed to, that affect whether those cancer genes get turned on or not. An example is my grandfather, who died of mesothelioma because when he was in the Army, he was working in asbestos fields. Okay, so he had a genetic risk for mesothelioma. He then had exposure to actually not just the asbestos, but he also worked on cars and was exposed to the risks there from the brakes of the cars. So those were some environmental factors that turned on the genes that he already had for a predisposition toward cancer. He did not get emphysema. right? So he whether he didn't have the risk factor for that, he smoked when he was younger, like many people did at that time. But we all carry different genes, and so we all carry different predispositions toward conditions. All right, all of this is to say that there are lots of reasons why a gene can get flipped on. Okay, so for some people, it may be an illness or an infection. Okay, what tends to happen with autoimmune diseases, remember that an autoimmune disease is an overreactivity of the immune system. So someone who has an autoimmune condition, their immune system is triggered easily, it's turned on easily. So instead of not mounting an immune response, which would be a different problem, right? Imagine if you got the flu and your immune system didn't kick on, you would probably die from the flu, right? Because your body is not fighting the flu. But the opposite is also possible, where your immune system is triggered very easily. And that could be problematic, as is exemplified by many autoimmune conditions. So if somebody has a major illness like the flu, a major infection, like a common one is Lyme disease, right? If you get an infection like that, you can end up sparking an overreactivity of the immune system, which it was primed for because of your genetics, and that may turn on the RA. And it's also possible that a major stressful life event could be, because remember, our stress and our immune system are very tied to each other. So this is why we know that college students get sick at finals time, right? Because the psychological stress of college finals can affect their immune system function. So they may be more predisposed to illness during that time. Stress can dampen our immune system, in other words, cause it to not function as well as it needs to. Stress can also ignite our immune system so that it overreacts. So the relationship between stress and our immune system is one of dysregulation. So it's often talked about that, if you're stressed, you're more likely to get a cold because your immune system is suppressed. But it's not that simple, because your immune system is dysregulated, which may mean suppression and it may mean activation. So a stressful life event could be the loss of a loved one. There's someone that I know well who was diagnosed with RA in her teens, and she found out that her grandparent had died, and her joint immediately swelled up, right? So some people are so sensitive that it's immediately visible that they have a physical reaction to stress. And I think all of us feel that to a certain extent. When we're very stressed, there are lots of things that aren't going as well in terms of our body function. For some people, they may notice that their digestion doesn't work as well. For some people, maybe they don't sleep as well as they might. For some people, they may get headaches, right? So our bodies are all different in terms of how they manifest that physical reaction to stress. And some people can pinpoint, it was when I got that very stressful job, or when I got laid off from the job, or when I bought my first house, or so they can see that there may be a relationship between some major stressful life event. And remember, not all stressful life events are bad. There is something called eustress, EUSTRESS. It's good stress, right? So like getting married, we hope, is a good kind of stress. Buying a first house is a good kind of stress. Having a child is a good kind of stress. So there are good events in our lives, starting a new job that we're really excited about, that are physiologically stressful for the body, even though we see them as positive events. And then there are the major life events that we all go through that are stressful in a negative way. Trauma, what we might consider to be trauma, is one subset of stressful life events. Okay, so I lost my mother recently. That was a stressful life event. I would not characterize it as trauma. I would characterize it as grief. And grief is just as physiological and definitely, I have felt all of the ups and downs in both my mind and my body and my heart and soul from having lost my mother. I would not characterize that as trauma. But for those who have experienced trauma, that could also trigger the onset of an autoimmune disease that you had a predisposition for genetically. Now, what I want to caution against is that when people learn this information, there's a tendency to want to say, what can I blame for my disease? What was the trigger that turned this disease on or that gave me this disease? And first of all, I want to suggest that the gene was there already. You were primed for this condition. And if it wasn't this event that turned it on, it could have been something else. As I said, we all experience major stressful life events, both good and bad. We all experience illness. We all experience infection, right? So any of those things throughout an entire lifespan could have triggered the onset of the disease. And for some people, they just wake up one day out of the clear blue sky and their knee is the size of a grapefruit. And there is no way to explain it in terms of linking it to a stressful life event. It could be a shift in hormones. So it's common for people to have changes in their disease status during different changes in their hormone structure. So when kids enter into puberty, sometimes they have they go through a period of remission and then their disease comes out of remission from all of the changes in hormones. It's also possible that around menopause that there are changes in immune function and or autoimmune conditions. And so that isn't necessarily a trauma, psychological trauma. It's a change in the physiology of the body that the body's having to adapt and adjust to, and that could be the thing that turns it on. And what I want to caution against is that whatever it was that triggered the onset of the disease already happened, and it is only useful information in that the things that trigger the onset of the disease are also the things that can trigger flares in the disease. Okay, so if you notice that your lupus started around the time that you started a new stressful job, then it's also possible that times when your job is stressful, your disease will flare. Okay, so instead of looking back and saying things like, if I only hadn't taken that job, or my job is the reason why I have this disease, I find it from a yogic perspective more useful to say, okay, here we are. I have this condition. It's something I'm going to have to live with and manage for a lifetime. What do I know about life events and stress and how it affects my disease that I can use in a forward-thinking way, that I can use to plan and strategize and adjust and balance my life, excuse me, in order to manage this condition better. Because we know that there's a relationship between stress and disease activity, just as we know that there is a relationship between stressful life events and autoimmune disease diagnosis. Okay. I also want to say that it's important, just as it is to not blame ourselves for any life events that have triggered this condition. It's also not useful to blame others, because I'm sure you've heard the saying that when you're pointing a finger for a pointing back at you, blame and shame both have effects on the body. So if we can use yoga philosophy to foster a sense of okayness with what is, here's where I am, here's what I have, how am I going to move forward and live my best possible life with whatever this is, I think is a useful perspective. And of course, the tools of yoga help with stress management. So if you notice that there's a relationship between your psychological stress and your disease activity, then the tools of yoga, especially breathing, meditation, gentle movement, can all help. And certainly philosophy, perspective, cognitive reframing can help with how we manage the disease by managing our stress better. Okay, so it was a very long explanation for the relationship between stressful life events and autoimmune disease. So there is a relationship. I will also say, from an evidence-informed perspective, that all of the studies that look at the relationship between stressful life events and autoimmune disease are observational studies, which is a limitation. It's necessary that those studies are observational because it is unethical to expose someone to stressful life events in order to see if they get an autoimmune disease. You can see how and why that would be hugely problematic. What studies have done experimentally is expose people to minor stressors like watching violent images or putting your hand in an ice bath for long periods of time. And you can see how the immune system responds in real time to those stressors, physiological stressors and psychological stressors. But there aren't any experiments linking trauma to autoimmune disease diagnosis for obvious reasons. And because these studies are observational, they are necessarily confounded by a whole variety of factors. So what we can't say trauma causes autoimmune disease. What we can say is people who have autoimmune disease have higher rates of traumatic experiences than people without autoimmune disease. There are lots of people with autoimmune disease who have never experienced a major traumatic life event. And there are plenty of people who have experienced trauma who never get an autoimmune disease, right? So it's not, as I said, a black and white relationship. And it's important to remember that, especially when we're thinking about not just our own health and well-being, but those of others. For those of you who are working with people who have autoimmune diseases, it's important that we not create a storyline that doesn't apply to them. And it's important for each of us to own our own health journey and define that for ourselves. Okay, so that is my even longer response to trauma. All right, so there was another question about online trainings. Okay, so someone contacted me who is not a yoga professional. So some of you are people living with arthritis and some of you are yoga professionals, and actually many of you are both. And so this question is about, well, what are the options? What are the training options for people who are not yoga professionals? All right, so we have one, if you go onto the website, you can go to, when you first go to the homepage, there's a place to choose people with arthritis as your category, right? There are 4 categories. It's people with arthritis, yoga professionals, healthcare professionals, and the media. They probably are not called that, but those are the general categories. If you click on the category for people with arthritis, at the top, there's a bar that says online classes and courses, okay? And in there, you'll find one-off classes, right? Recorded classes that you can use for home practice. But you'll also find 2 courses. We right now have 2 courses for people with arthritis, not yoga professionals, who are not yoga professionals. One is an introduction, and it's entirely didactic. So it's just me teaching about the relationship between yoga and arthritis, how yoga can be applied to arthritis. And I talk about things that somebody wants to consider who is using a yoga practice to manage their arthritis. There's also an experience in there. I do a joint mobilization series in there, but it's a lot of information about things to consider when you're using yoga for arthritis management. So that's the introductory course. Then there's also a resource pack. And the resource pack really is a set of tools for home practice. So that resource pack first has a lecture just about the research on this program, the Yoga for Arthritis program, which is an evidence-based program. It's been studied at Johns Hopkins and NIH, and now we're using elements of this program at a study in New York at Sinai, Einstein, and Montefiore hospitals. So a little bit of that is explained, and then there are 4 classes. There's a mat class, a wall class, a chair class, and a gentle class that starts and ends with restorative. So those 4 classes are there. There's an audio recording of a guided relaxation. And then there's a student manual. And the student manual gives you a bunch of different poses and modifications for those poses, so that if you're using the videos or if you're doing a home practice without the videos, you have ideas about how might I do this pose in a way that works for my body. And it has explanations of all of the poses too. And then some reading materials. So articles about the relationship between breath and arthritis, and how meditation helps, and stress, and all of those things. So articles that are really geared more toward people living with arthritis. That's in the resource pack. We also have a couple of holiday packages that we just put out recently. One is a digital pack, and the other is an analog pack. And so the analog one has the book, the actual physical book, the actual physical DVD, the manual. So for those of you who like hard copies of things and you want to use hard copies of things to fuel your home practice, you might be interested more in the analog pack than in the digital pack. So the analog and digital holiday packages are available in the store, whereas those courses that I just mentioned are available in the classes and courses section of the page. Okay, all of that is for people living with arthritis. I was also asked about trainings, and so I'll just give you an update on where we are with live trainings for those of you who have that interest. So this now shifting from people living with arthritis to yoga professionals. We are currently in we're running right now from now until March, the second half of a level 1 hybrid program. So this is the first time we've ever done this. About half the training was done over a weekend in person. And then the other half of the training is now happening online over the course of a few months. So this video is going out to the folks who are in that hybrid course right now. And this was really the first time we've ever tried this, and I'm excited to see how it happens, but it's already ongoing. So that's not something that you can join now if you aren't already in it. We are considering hybrid programs in the future, but we don't have anything scheduled at this time. We have 2 level 1 programs that are scheduled. One is down in Yogaville, Virginia, Buckingham, Virginia, at the Integral Yoga Satchidananda Ashram, and that will be led by me, and that's in March. And just a plug for that, Yogaville is beautiful. Just, expansive rolling hills and trees. And in March, Virginia is lovely. And you're at an ashram, so you get to meditate in a beautiful shrine, and there are swamis living there, and the food is awesome. So yeah, so that's a great one. And then we also have one happening later in 2020. So the one in Yogaville is in March. The one in New York is in June, early June. And the New York program, so this is in Manhattan at the Integral Yoga Institute. near sort of Chelsea and the Village. And I absolutely love the Integral Yoga Institute for a variety of reasons. It's in this old, 5-6 story walk up in New York, right next to a natural food store. It's a great little neighborhood. It's an institute, and there are people who live there. There are swamis there as well. And there's so much happening in this building that you totally unassuming in the middle of New York that it's pretty remarkable. But what is especially cool about the training in New York is that it's team taught by an amazing team of folks who have been working with me for 10 years now, and have been running this training every year. It happens in New York every year. And because of that, there's this whole beautiful sangha of teachers who are trained in this work and doing this work in New York. And every year when they hold the training, they also have a big gathering of all the teachers. And so you'll meet people who have been doing this work, and there is always an opportunity over a lunch to learn from people who have not only been through the program, but been doing this work for years, and to really learn from them. And if you live anywhere near there, there's actually an opportunity to do your level 2 training, Yoga for Arthritis level 2 training in New York. They have a twice weekly Yoga for Arthritis and Chronic Pain class. It's a drop-in therapeutic yoga class, which also is a really cool model, and you can learn more about that. Anybody who has questions about it, I'm happy to answer them. But I think it's a pretty novel model that they really have refined over years. And you can do your level 2 by observing, assisting, and teaching in that twice weekly class. So they have a sign up that goes around every month where people sign up for which classes they're going to teach and assist for that class. So that's pretty cool. Those trainings are part of the Integral Yoga Therapy training. So you can get credit toward your yoga therapy training if you're doing that through Integral. You can also count it for Phoenix Rising. So if any of you are doing your yoga therapy training with Phoenix Rising, these count toward that as well. And they also count as CEUs, both for Yoga Alliance or for IAYT. So whether you're a yoga teacher or a yoga therapist, you can count all of the hours of the level 1 trainings, no matter where they're held, for your professional continuing education. Okay, so those were all of the questions that I got in advance. I have not seen any new questions added to the chat. So if anybody who's on now does have questions, please type them in. Otherwise, this may be an abbreviated session. So I'll just give it another minute if there's anybody who's typing a question in. And also, feel free to email me questions at any time. So obviously being on, not everybody's able to make the call live, and that's very understandable. But if you would like your question addressed, then send it to me by email, info@arthritis.yoga or Stephanie@arthritis.yoga, but then you have to spell Stephanie right. So feel free to email me a question at any time, and I'll include it in the next month's Q&A. So you might have to wait to get your response, but it'll be on the recording when I do that. Okay, and I don't see any questions coming in, so I'm going to say thank you to those of you who are here and to those of you who are watching, and I hope that you're all having a wonderful holiday season, that it's bright and full of love and community and moderation and R&R as needed. And I'll look forward to seeing you next month.